So vicho elecho por aduma tamimo. You should take for yourselves a red heifer, unblemished. Tamim means perfect, perfectly red. Asher ein bo mum. It doesn't have a blemish. Asher lo ol. And there was never a yoke put on it. And the Mishnah says even more than that. If a person put anything on it to carry, person put his walking staff, his jacket on it, on the animal's disqualified, is invalidated. But we're going to talk right now, what is the Zos Chukas HaTorah? This is the ultimate statute of the Torah. V'isha Sotan v'umos ha'olam modin is Yisrael. Satan, Satan, and the nations of the world, they aggrieve the Jewish people, meaning they criticize us. Loma ma mitzvah zos. What is this all about? Ma tam yesh bo. Two things. What is the mitzvah? And what is its reason? First, they're asking about the veracity. Secondly, what is the tam? What is the reason? The ficha kosav chuko. Therefore, the Torah says chuka. It's a statute. Gzerim lefonai. It's a decree which is given for me. Elcho shus laharachreo. You're not permitted even to try to speculate, because the Torah is telling us it's impossible to figure it out. Now we speak about speculation. When a person speculates, what does that mean? It's within the realm of, there are certain indicators, so therefore it's the realm of maybe you come upon its essence. The Torah is saying here, Zos Chukas HaTorah. You're not permitted even to question it, and due to questions, you come to the understanding of what it is, because it's an impossibility to understand. And if it's impossible to understand, whatever you come up with is incorrect. You understand? Speculation is there's what to go on, and therefore there's a chance I could figure it out what it is. Very often you ask certain questions. If it's a valid question, the question leads to an answer. Because if you have enough analysis and you point out certain characteristics, that directs you to come to a conclusion, to understand the inner workings of something. The Torah is telling you here, Zos Chuk, this is the ultimate statute. As much as you focus on it, it is impossible to understand it. Therefore, whatever you come up with is incorrect. Therefore, you're not even permitted to try to analyze it, to make the analysis, because whatever you come up with is going to be incorrect. Let's talk about dietary laws. It seems to be, Paraduma is where they come and Satan whispers in their ears. The Umas Olam, nations of the world, say, it doesn't make any sense. And just because a person doesn't understand something, that's not a base say it doesn't make any sense. A person says, the heart, its structure, it's 4 chambers, but why? We don't have an answer. Is there a base say it doesn't make sense? We don't understand. The Torah says, God says, you're not permitted to cook milk and meat. You have to slaughter an animal. You have to ritual slaughter. It's a statute. Why from the neck, and why the esophagus and the trachea and not differently, and why if there's a nick, why is it not valid? This is all statutes. But they don't agree with us for that. For the Paraduma, for the red heifer, there is a basis to come and say, your laws don't make any sense. It's ridiculous. And by presenting it as a criticism, as an attack, this actually could make us feel that there is a basis for that kind of comment, for that criticism. Torah says no. Don't even try to figure it out. Don't even try to respond. Because it's the word of Hashem, it's beyond your grasp. Okay? If you look in the Midrash, there are a number of statutes, which it's not only the Pur Aduma, the red heifer, there are others which they come and they also have the same point, which they criticize us and they say, it's ridiculous. There's an inconsistency or there's an inner contradiction. For instance, the Torah says a Jew is not permitted to wear a combination of wool and linen, known as shatnez. But yet, if you have a four-cornered garment made of wool, of linen, you have an obligation to put wool tzitzis into those four corners. Because tcheles, that red dye, that blue, green, or whatever the color is, blue, green, there's a question what the color is, comes from a certain type of species, and that can only be applied to wool. Can't even be applied to any other material other than wool. So if you have a four-cornered garment made of linen, that means you have to put wool tzitzis, which have tcheles. By doing that, you're creating a combination of wool and linen. So the question is, if the combination of wool and linen, spiritually speaking, is contradictory to one spirituality, why, if you put tzitzis, why is it permitted? As they say, it doesn't make any sense. If it's innately something which is lethal to your spirituality, why, within the context of tzitzis, is it permitted? A sister-in-law is considered an incestuous relationship. A brother is not permitted to marry a brother's wife after she's divorced, after she's widowed, if there are any children. But yet, if she dies, if the brother dies childless, there's a mitzvah to perform levirate marriage, what we call yibum. So it's the same thing. If the relationship between a brother-in-law and a sister-in-law is incestuous and it carries a very severe level of liability, and if there's a child conceived, the child is illegitimate. But yet, if the sister-in-law has no children from the brother, there's a mitzvah, and it's encouraged to perform yibum, levirate marriage, and the child is not illegitimate. So again, the question is, if the nature of this relationship is something which is off limits to the degree that it carries a very serious liability, and the child is illegitimate, why, if the brother dies childless, not only is it not forbidden, it's obligatory, and the child's not illegitimate? Doesn't make any sense. If the nature of this relationship innately is something which is detrimental to your spirituality and produces this issue, why is it permitted? These are the kinds of questions. So every question which is asked, the Gemara tells us, the Torah tells us, and the Gemara tells us, there's a discussion, if a woman gives birth to a male, so the Torah says, for 7 days she's contaminated, and for the following 33 days, if it's a male, even if she continues to menstruate, she's permitted to the husband if she goes to the mikveh. And the Gemara tells us that the blood, the menstrual blood, is the exact same blood of a woman who's a menstruant. But yet, at this moment, after she gives birth, she's permitted. So the Midrash says, what do they come? They say, if actually a woman in a state of menstruation, which carries a very severe liability, which is chores, and it generates a level of contamination, is not permitted, why, after she gives birth to a male for 33 days, although she continues to menstruate, it's the same source of blood, why is she permitted to the husband? As they say, it doesn't make any sense. And what to top it off, the Pur Aduma, it's Matayris Atmeim, and it's Matamias Atorim. The only level of contamination which you can't relieve yourself by going to the mikvah is the contamination of the dead. Yet, if you undergo the ritual, the Pur Aduma, it relieves you of the most severe level of contamination, which mikvah does not by itself. You need the Pur Aduma, but yet, if you carry the mixture of the ash with the water, you become contaminated. So the solution which relieves you of the most severe level of contamination, if you carry that, you become contaminated. Doesn't make any sense. So we're talking about the basis for the criticism and to put us in the position where it looks like foolishness is because the inner contradiction which exists within the mitzvah itself. What does Hashem say? It's my statute, you have no right to question it. Oh, right. We read that in the Alanisim, in time of the Greeks, when they issued many decrees that were not permitted to study Torah, it says they did not allow us to study Torah to remove us from God's statutes. What does the learning of Torah have to do with remove us from God's statutes? When a person studies Torah and you have a sense and you're spiritualized through the study of Torah, the many questions would normally bother a person, doesn't bother a person. Due to the level of spiritualization and the mindset, the way you touch through Torah, although we don't understand, because it's a statute, and even where it's an inter-contradiction, we have a sense, and it creates a trust and a credibility, the question doesn't bother us. So by removing us from Torah, the Greeks understood, as a result of that, the Jews will say, it doesn't make any sense. The only person to ask that question, doesn't make any sense, is the person who's not immersed in Torah. But if you're immersed in Torah, and you're touched, and you have a sense of God through Torah, that question's not a question. The question only needs an answer, only if the question is a question. But if God has his credibility, and we understand it's beyond our grasp, and it's not within our capacity to even process it, the question is not a question. Therefore, over here, the Torah says, Zos chukas haTorah. This is the ultimate. Chazal tells that even Shlomo Melech says, who understood every statute. Shlomo Melech understood through his bordering on the infinite wisdom, he understood every statute. He says, when it came to the Paraduma, Rechokim mimeni. This is even beyond my grasp. Now the question is, why, regarding every other statute, as we just explained, they're contradictory? Tzitzis, although you create a combination of wool and linen, it's permitted. The woman, normally, she would not be permitted. But after she gives birth to a male or a female, during a certain period of time, she's permitted. The sister-in-law, although it's an incestuous relationship, but if the brother should die childless, the same woman would normally be incest and illegitimate, the child, it's not only permitted, it's an obligation to perpetuate the name of the deceased. And here the same thing. Everything he understood, this one he couldn't grasp. Why could he grasp it? There's something about Paraduma that even Shlomo Melech wasn't able, was beyond his grasp. So over here there's a beautiful Orach Chaim HaKadosh, which he asks a very basic question, which is a question. If we would want to use a term to classify Paradum, what would we say? Zos chukas hatara, right? This is the statute of purification. Or Zos chukas hatuma, this is the statute of spiritual contamination. But yet, when the Torah goes and depicts this particular statute, it's Zos chukas haTorah. It's the statute of the Torah. So somehow this chok, this statute, has relevance to the Torah itself. I mean, all statutes have relevance to the Torah. Every statute is rooted in the Torah. So why when we speak about Paraduma, the red heifer, is it specifically Zos chukas haTorah? That's the question Orach Chaim HaKadosh asks. So he says something, points at something phenomenal. When we did the first Pesach, Paschal, we did, was in Egypt. There's no mention of spiritual contamination. I mean, we lived as pagans. We're exposed to the dead. But yet, a prerequisite for the Pesach, the Paschal, which we brought on the 15th, we participated on the 15th of Nisan, there was no pre-preparation to make sure to be a pure state. Why? He says very simple. Because before Sinai, what was our classification? Before Sinai, our classification, we were B'nai Noach. We're Noahites. A non-Jew could go into a cemetery. Non-Jew could come in direct contact with the dead. A non-Jew does not contaminate. Pre-Sinai, our status were Noahites, therefore we were not subject to contamination. When did we become subject to contamination? The spiritual contamination. Whether you come in contact with the dead, the remains of an animal, or certain rodents that it contaminates. This happened at Sinai. Why? Because there was a transition, there was a metamorphosis in our essence, that we went from Ben Noach, we became Yisrael. We advanced to a level of Yisrael. Yisrael are subject to contamination. Ben Noach is not subject to contamination. And the words of the Na'ar Chaim, his words are, just as an animal is not subject to contamination, identically, a non-Jew is not subject to contamination, because the spiritual core of a non-Jew is not the spiritual core of a Jew. The Nishmas Yisrael, the soul of a Jew, is a different dimension of spirituality, which is not the non-Jews. So he goes to explain. Now, what is the body of a Jew? The body of a Jew is the receptacle, is the domicile for the neshama. If you have a bottle of perfume and you empty the bottle, even after the bottle is empty, there is a fragrance which remains because the bottle or the flask contained that perfume. Even after a Jew dies and the body and the neshama departs from the body, the physicality of the body, the remnants of that kedusha, which represent the neshama of the Jew, which are beyond, it's at a mega level, which remain associated with that body. Now, what is the basis for spiritual contamination? What is the basis? So he goes to explain the basis of spiritual contamination, that in existence, there has to be a balance and a counterbalance. There's a representation of good, which is Kedusha, and there's a representation which are referred to as Nether Forces. God created Nether Forces. They created forces which are of Kedusha, of purity. Everything in existence has to be sustained. Nothing can exist unless it's sustained by God, and that is the Kedusha. So now, the Nether Forces, when a person's alive, a person, again, unless he comes direct contact with the dead, he doesn't come contaminated, or with the remains of an animal, what we call nevela, or with certain rodents. But when a person dies, what happens? The intensity of the neshama is no longer there. Automatically, what happens is there are endless numbers of these nether forces which immediately attach themselves to the body of the Jew, because that body was the receptacle which had the neshama. So as a result of this onslaught, overwhelming level of nether forces which attach itself to the body, that is the basis for the spiritual contamination. And therefore a non-Jew is matabi bo'er. Wait 1 second. Wait 1 second. 1 second. Therefore a non-Jew, there's a machloks tanoim. If a non-Jew, you go into a tent or to a covered area with the remains of a non-Jew, you don't become contaminated. But if you go into a location which is covered, where a Jew is there, the remains of a Jew, you're contaminated. Everybody agrees, you come direct contact with the remains, Jew and non-Jew, you're contaminated identically the same. But a Jew, even if you don't come in direct contact, you go over the grave, you're under the same roof as the remains of a Jew, you're contaminated. So he explains, because the level of nether forces which come upon the Jew are endlessly greater than the nether forces which attach themselves to the body of a non-Jew, because the body of a non-Jew is also a receptacle for the neshama. But the soul of a non-Jew, has no relevance to the dimension of the soul of a Jew. So the degree and intensity of Kedusha, which remains associated with the body of a Jew, even after the soul departs, is another level. Therefore, the level of nether forces which attach themselves are much greater. Therefore, the impurity which is generated from the remains contaminates even not upon direct contact, just being associated under the same roof or passing over the grave. And he gives a mashal. He gives an example. He says, you have a pail, and the pail contained nectar, fruit nectar, or honey. You empty the pail. What happens after you empty the pail? You leave the pail out in the field. All kinds of rodents, all kinds of insects are attracted to that because of the purity of what was there. But let's say you have a pail that was filled with manure, and you empty that pail. A lot less will be attracted to that. If it's that pure honey nectar, every rodent, every insect is attracted to that. So that, he says, that is the body of a Jew. Because the dimension of the neshama of a Jew in terms of its dimension of kedusha, of holiness, and since every living entity, every existing entity needs to be sustained by kedusha, because God wills its existence, so wherever it can find a level of association with that representation, it's attracted there like a magnet. That's the Orach Chaim HaKodesh. And he repeats this in the Chumash Vayikra, that we find that a consecrated animal, a korban, if it becomes nosar, you eat it, you chayv koris. You have the liability of spiritual excision. One eats the vela, one is not liable for koris. A regular animal, because it was consecrated, if it reached the expiration point, the liability is very severe. But if it's never ritually slaughtered, it doesn't have that level of liability. It's only a losas, it's a negative command. He says, why? Because the korban initially, what was it? It had kedushas mizbeach, had the sanctity of the mizbeach, which it was at a level it can be brought and have relevance to Hashem himself. Now that kedusha has become defunct, but because there's a remnant of its representation identically, therefore the level of liability and consequence is for the same reason, because the nether forces have a greater relevance of association with that, because it was a representation of that very advanced level of kedusha, which represented, it was designated for God for the service of Hashem. Okay, Ernie, what do you want to ask?
Yeah,